Michael, hello.
Hi.
We're here to record a video, and we actually are roommates now, which is why you may have seen fewer videos of us than recently. So, Michael is literally right here, and now I can talk to you through either screen, which is very confusing. Yeah, anyway, so we're gonna record a video, and we figured that the Zoom recording interface is actually a pretty good way to do that because then we're facing each other, facing the cameras. You can see both of us. It's great. It's great.
Yeah.
So, he's gonna go to his room, and I'm gonna stay in mine, and we're gonna talk. And the thing we're gonna talk about is some Michael is gonna attempt to convey to me some a pretty powerful recursive seed that he has found for sorting out sub questions of he's referring to it sometimes as subjective science, but we could also talk about it in terms of sorting out why people do what they do, why you do what you do, and why you are sometimes tempted to try to intervene on systems doing what they do in ways that on some level won't work, but you are inclined to do it anyway. And I have the sense that what he's onto here um, is actually on a really deep level the same as my non-naive trust stance framework. And if anything, a powerful instantiation of a new seed of it. So I wanted him to convey that to me, and I figure might as well do that in a medium where other people get to listen in. So that's what we're going to do. We are not, in general, going to attempt to be particularly more accessible than we need to be, because that makes the conversation maximally fun for us. But feel free to ask questions in the comments, and we can answer them in the comments or in future videos.
Yeah.
Just a sec.
hmm
Alrighty. So, yeah, let's dive in. I just gave a summary. I think you heard of what we're going to talk about.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Right. And part of the reason we were jumping in this moment as opposed to some other one is because, I mean, for one thing, we had some time, but also you're really alive with some stuff about like this confusion you have around how to engage with politics and sorting out some stuff with your dad and conversations with other people and orienting and so on.
mhm.
So it seems like there's a lot of potency that can happen from staying grounded in like how does it actually apply there.
Right,
Um,
to a situation, not just sort of in the abstract. And
right. And
and even though politics is, a bit of a hot topic, I feel pretty comfortable talking about it publicly compared to stuff that's more about like my personal life and what's going on there or
right.
whatever
Yeah.
in private relationships.
Yeah. It
Uh,
also seems worth noting, especially for anybody who might be watching this, that like that what we have to talk about is not the content of politics. Like that might come up, but
yeah.
the actual relevant part is how are we relating to the attempts to have those conversations and the sort of efforts that arise in us in relationship to other people. Um, it's not predominantly about what view is correct.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
it's
Except
actually
insofar
importantly
as
not that.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so I want to see if I
One other
can.
tiny operational thing before we dive in. I will probably be typing a little bit during this conversation. That's not me being distracted. That's me taking notes that I will put like links and stuff in the footer thing too. Um, somebody got confused on a previous video. They're like, was Malcolm just doing something else the whole time he was talking? Um,
Yes, he was doing many things, all
yeah,
related to the conversation.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, um, at a high level, I'm still struggling to articulate this thing. So it's very closely related to how the conscious and subconscious minds relate to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the processing and understanding is happening at the non-conscious level. This is pretty normal for me on in some ways, but this particular insight is especially about handing control over to the subconscious mind in places where that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's included a lot of the process of articulating this even to myself. So
Mm-hmm.
it's coming into words and frames,
Yeah,
but it's taking longer than a lot of other things have for
yeah.
me.
Which is one of the other reasons we wanted to talk about it right now.
Yeah.
Right. It's because it's right on your edge of being able to articulate, and so it's like, okay, well, let's draw it out in a space that's amenable to that.
Yeah, yeah. So, um, one piece that feels pretty central to me is that um, every time, uh, I think this is for anyone, but I'll speak from first person here. Anytime I am interacting with someone and trying to affect them in some way, like it's not just incidental, like I'm walking past, like, I don't know, even when I'm walking past someone and I say hi, but for the most part, most interactions have implicit in them what I keep wanting to call a theory of change.
Hmm.
It's that um, like I have to have some sort of implicit like goal or need or thing that I'm navigating in contact with them together with a model of how I expect that to occur in interaction with the other person. Um, so this comes to the fore. I mean, in a lot of cases, it's very straightforward. Like if I'm saying hi to somebody I'm just passing on the street, it's pretty easy. It's like, oh well, I'm I have an anticipation that the way that they and I interact, like if we make eye contact and they're sort of staring at me for a few seconds, there's like a tension, and I want to resolve my experience of that tension, which includes my model of their experience of the tension, and just saying hello, like as I'm passing by.
Right. So it serves to do that, but give an example that kind of has a little bit more punch to it, a little bit more like
Sure.
a little more central of an example, even if a tiny one.
Yeah, I'm to think it's very easy for me to think of examples where it's failing because I'm those are the ones I've been zooming in on. Um, but like, okay, so like stuff with like my uh, like my parents have been trying to sort out some stuff with their physical health and coordination as they're getting older.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had an idea about, okay, I think like when I was last visiting them, that okay, there were a couple of ideas that I had about, okay, if I show them some things about Qigong, that I think that this will both help their coordination and their physical activity, and also if I show it to them in a certain way, like if I walk dad through some of this process, and then I engage mom in it, and then while they're engaged in it, I just encourage this to be something that we do after lunch each day, and
Mm.
then after that, I like check with them about, okay, so what's the next step in the routine? By the end of that, they will have a routine that I expect them to actually do.
Mm.
And that worked out. Like, and I
Nice.
wasn't trying to be sneaky about any of it. I was pretty explicit about, oh, I think if we do this, that'll help you guys to establish a routine. So this
Yeah,
wasn't
nice.
just subterfuge.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
um, so that's a case where I had a desire, which is that I want to encourage my parents to maintain their health, and that requires me to change their behavior.
Hmm.
And then the intervention I did turned out well. I was accurate
Hmm.
in my models there. Um, the place where I find things especially important or interesting, where it's been particularly trippy as I've been trying to
Hmm.
make sense of this stuff, um, has been in the places where I can tell that, like, in some sense, I know that what I'm trying to do in a given moment or in a given situation doesn't make sense. And yet, I persist. So this
Yeah.
is stuff like um, when in certain kinds of political situations, like in some of the stuff that you and I have talked about for this workshop series that we're
Hmm.
sorting out, when there's a tension um, between some of the people and me, and I feel unheard, my immediate response is often a kind of irritation, and like I want to cut through with some irritation and explain the reasoning.
Hmm.
And in many cases, this backfires if I actually follow along with that. People become more resistant, it increases the tension.
Right. And
Uh,
despite knowing that, there's the behavior.
right, right.
Yeah.
And in other contexts, when I notice, oh, in like I don't know, like if I'm cutting vegetables in a way that doesn't work, and I pause and I notice why, and it's like, oh, it's because of the angle of the knife, and then I start cutting it. Each time I make the mistake, it becomes a reminder for me to change the behavior with the knife. So the negative feedback, or the unpleasant feedback, I should say, um, comes back socially, and instead of adjusting to a strategy that I expect to work better, I actually double down on the one that
Right, right,
doesn't.
right, right. Like what's going on there?
Right,
Yeah.
right. So
Somehow the feedback isn't landing with whatever system is generating the thing in the first place or something. It's like
yeah,
getting stopped by some other system, maybe?
right, right. Um, so that's interesting. It's like,
Yeah.
what's up with that? And the default thing that I typically want to do in those situations is to try to make myself do the thing that makes sense
To your conscious mind.
to my conscious mind.
Yeah.
Right. So, um, so this highlights another background theory piece. So I'd say one piece is this thing about theory of change,
Hmm.
which is that every interaction has implicit in it a theory about what the structure is of the problem that you're trying to change, and
Yeah.
therefore this intervention will somehow interact with the problem
Yeah.
in the way that you want.
Can I make a posit of the particular thing that's trippy?
Yeah,
So, um, if you're simply trying to change, well, there's like changing the state of a physical object, which is some combination of skill and motivation or whatever. I lift this up. I've changed the whatever, there's like more complex systems, but whatever. Then there's changing some sort of fairly basic behavior of a system, like, oh, hey, by the way, we're putting the bottles and the pump parts in one bin now instead of two, by the way. So when you empty the dishwasher, this is a thing I said to you last week. Now they go in one bin rather than two,
yeah.
so don't be confused. Um, right? Like that's sort of like that's just me changing a behavior. But the thing that gets trippy is when the thing that you're trying to change is actually itself a theory of change, yours or somebody else's.
Closely related. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the big thing that happened for me was actually that my theory of change changed, and
Your sort of biggest picture, your conscious theory of change.
no, the biggest one, which included the conscious theory, and getting that to snap together consciously is part of what allowed my conscious mind to align in sensible ways with the background thing that's going on. But when I talk about you have a theory of change, most of the time it's subconscious. Um,
Hmm. I'm so curious about the nature of bigger, but I think that would be premature theorization here. I want to get into, can you walk me through doing this theory of change thing for myself?
yeah, yeah.
And you can say one
One
or
other
two more
piece.
pieces if you
Yeah,
want, but
there's one other piece I want to have in the middle for doing so, just so I can
Mhm.
gesture at it. Um, uh, there's another piece that I keep wanting to say. This is related to the everything makes sense stuff.
Mhm.
But another way of saying it is that um, all life is an expression of knowledge about how not to die.
Mhm.
And intelligence is a specific example of knowledge, or intelligence is a description of the dynamic knowledge that is in life, or that is life. Again, I'm not sure
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
exactly how to define this, but um, when I think of things like like a mutual friend who I'd mentioned just went to Puerto Rico, for instance.
Mhm.
She was wrestling with some political stuff, and the way that she was frustrated about it, uh, like she wanted to just get these people to listen to her and to stop doing stupid stuff. But implicit in that is a kind of I want to say something like a disrespect for the problem set that each other person is running.
Mhm.
Um, I if you One of the things that has clicked for me here is that um, it's impossible to just be stupid.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I intellectually understood that before, but it's become more of a perception,
Mhm.
and that I don't want to have to track all of the problems and solutions that are in other nodes of intelligence, such as other people and what's going on in trees and so on. Um, the whole point of having other people that I'm working with is that they are solving problems that I don't have to solve.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm inclined here to throw in just a funny quip, which is, um, like I recently had an experience of, or about a year ago, I was hanging out with my grandmother, the one who passed this last fall, and she was describing somebody else, and she said, "She's just stupid. I've never met anybody so stupid." And coming from this mentality that you just referred to of everything makes sense, which is something that had struck me. There had, like an insight to that effect had struck me with my NNTD insight in 2020. I had this funny double attitude where first, when I heard my grandmother describe this person as stupid, I was like, oh man, come on, like what they're doing must make some kind of sense, blah 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 blah. Um, and then I was like, okay, but also what my grandmother is doing makes some kind of sense. And I was like, what sense does that make? And sort of realizing like, oh, stupid is a characterization of it seems to function as a characterization of somebody to give up on. It's like it is not worth your time to try to sort things out with this, which is an important classification to sort of be able to have, but it's important to recognize that as like a property of the interface. Like you might have nothing useful that you can do in relation to them, and you need to be able to tag that interface as such. But that's different from, as you just say, the system actually being stupid in this sense. So it's not about intelligence. It is possible to be less or more intelligent in whatever way, but like something being incapable of being reasoned with or negotiated with or sense made with. Like that is a property of an interface with something, but it's a skill issue on your part also. Is kind of the
Yeah,
part of what I think you're also getting at.
yeah, 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 exactly. The place where I would where it gets trippy is when like there's a like when I say every time you interact with someone, you are implicitly operating within a theory of change. This includes interacting with yourself. So when when I look at a situation like this, um, like if I'm listening to the grandmother here
Mm-hmm.
and going, wait, but in what way does this make sense? There's kind of there's a way where if I'm looking at that going, oh no, everything makes sense. So let me examine this to see how it makes sense. There's I'm already implicitly bringing in a theory about how I work, where
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to change my thinking pattern by applying some sort of effort into thinking differently.
Mm-hmm.
Because like if I don't put in any of that effort, is what's the default? Is the default no? I mean that's dumb. You don't just call people dumb.
Wait.
Uh, or yeah, she is stupid. Or this is
Right, right.
complicated and I don't know how to think about
Yeah.
this, but whatever. Like there's an implicit extra thing that has to happen there. One of the things that has arisen for me in all of this, which like this definitely feels on the edge of my articulation, this particular part, um, but it's something like every place that I'm applying effort, uh, it's often confused. The very specific way in which it's confused, this is having me realize there's a third component that is very critical here. The way in which it's confused is that theories of change that are not grounded in what I would say is science
Mm-hmm.
um, are necessarily partial. They are necessarily uh, not as adaptive. This is in some sense by definition, but
Right, but like in some sense, no theory of change is complete.
well, sure.
So when you say partial, do you mean they're missing relevant parts? Like they're sort of
You ask a good question. Uh, what precisely do I mean? Okay, so I'm gonna grab an example that this was the example that really had it click for me. I think I described this to you before.
mm-hmm,
The thing about okay, so you have the survival and thrival systems that by default are sort of opposed,
mm-hmm.
um, and
I'll link to
but
the thing about that in the
yeah. It's
Yeah, I got it.
what's it? Thankful theory, and something like that. That's the name of the article that
Yeah,
this comes from. But I don't know that he mentioned survival and thrival. I don't remember.
yeah, he
It's just
does.
oh, he does. Okay,
I think
cool.
so.
Um, uh, but regardless of the space efficient, time efficient algorithm stuff, like I don't know about that. That's interesting. But the the main thing is that those two systems can by default end up in a tension, even though they both need each other in their own terms.
Hmm.
So, for instance, this means that if I want to have an abundance mindset, uh, there there is a reason why I don't have an abundance mindset already. Like if I'm worried about the money situation, I'm
Hmm.
going, well, like, but I should just relax. I'm like, well, okay, if if having an abundance mindset somehow helps with the money situation that my fear, scarcity,
Hmm.
survival system is tracking, then that means that that should be what amounts to a testable claim.
Hmm.
So I can then do what I would consider to be good science, which is I can find a test who, for practical reasons, I would want to make it something I can afford, which is to say, if the survival system was correct that this was a bad idea, can I handle the consequences? So, for instance, I don't take all of my money, max out my credit cards, and put it all on black on a roulette wheel.
Hmm.
Um, just thinking abundance, abundance. Like that's just like
Yeah.
if it turned out to work, that would be pretty amazing. But the fact is that if it doesn't, I can't handle the consequences very well.
Hmm.
So knowing that, I can do smaller tests that are things like, well, I could try to make sure I'm being productive today, but what if I just try an experiment of relaxing and going for a walk in the afternoon? Even though I could be productive, this
Right.
helps me to expand and be open. And if it turns out that that was a bad idea, I've lost an afternoon of productivity. That's not too bad.
Right. But it might be that it actually helps with your productivity or helps with your ability to orient to your financial situation or whatever. You can kind of feel some amount of that difference.
Right, right. So it opens up the hypothesis to falsification that thrival methods will help in survival's terms.
Oh, nice. And then when you talk about crucial tests, which is the thing you've been talking about a bunch in this context, um, I don't actually know what the history is exactly of the word crucial and crux here, but of course, it got amplified and remixed by the rationalists coming up with the double crux method. I think Kenzie and Critch or something like that. Um, where and I'm what I'm seeing is like this also has the double crux property. It's like you need in a sense an experiment that sort of the subsystems that are in tension here sort of agree directionally speaking about what would constitute some evidence on some level. You don't have to spec it all out in advance, but there needs to be like in order for the experiment to be good, it needs to get at some difference in what you'd expect based on some calibration or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't know if it's a double crux, but yeah, it is cruxy.
yeah.
The word crux and crucial both have their root in the same place as the word cross.
Yeah, yeah. What's the link there?
I don't know, but
Yeah. I mean, Crux has an intersection nature, which could
yeah.
could simply be it, but yeah,
I think this is kind of an
a
etymology
tangent.
rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But yes, crucial test. That's definitely part of
Yeah.
what's
I
going on.
continue to want to dive into like walk me through it.
Yeah. Okay. Um, yeah, sure. I can hop over some stuff and we can just try it. So you have the situation where you're uh, I want to quickly flag before we do that, because the reason I was doing that was because I was trying to contrast that process as opposed to what it means to have an incomplete or partial theory of
Ah,
change.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, let me just quickly tie that together, and
Cool.
then we can move on.
Great.
Uh, the default thing that I often see people do, and I've done this with myself too, in trying to evaluate, well, I don't know, does an abundance mindset help me to become more expansive and easier to relate to people, and this allows money to flow. But I don't know if I trust that. But I'm sort of nervous about it. But maybe my distrust of that by this principle is actually making it harder for that flow to happen and for people to plug in. So you don't even need to have a full law of attraction thing. You can just be like, socially, if we're all like, if I have a more abundance mindset, maybe this helps money to flow better. If what I do is I take that argument of, oh, this is why the thrival system would help in survival's terms. And then I take that to try to make my survival system shut up.
Hmm. Versus
Uh,
say, okay, if that's true,
right.
let's find out.
So then the question becomes, why does that make sense? Rather than looking at that as, oh, I'm being dumb in this particular way, there is some reason why my way of operating is having me try to force this view in opposition to the survival system.
Right. So now you're recursing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
This is where it gets trippy
Hmm.
because the recursion, there is no end to the recursion, but you don't have to reason through all the steps. You just need to make sure that all of the recursive layers are straight. The
Hmm.
place where they straighten out, and this is much more intuitive. I don't know how
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
be precise about this part, but you can't straighten them out with rules. You can only straighten them out with good epistemology.
With
This
learn.
is what I mean by it's partial if you're not using good science.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I want to kind of make the analogy between someone who understands something about the nature of math and how to solve certain types of mathematical problems versus somebody else who's like they're following some rule or heuristic that might even be right in this particular case, but then when they try to apply it somewhere else, they get all tangled up and they don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Symbol
Except the difference is
manipulation
when you're
versus
dealing with social
understanding
situations,
structure.
it's like rarely have a partial heuristic that works 100% of the time, which you can have in math. Like you're like, well, just do this, and that will in fact work every time, even though you don't know why and it doesn't make sense to you. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. So do you want to dive into your example?
I do. Cool.
All right.
So,
Um, yeah. So you've got this thing with your dad and politics.
right.
Um, and my understanding is that I mean, earlier when you described it, um, the impression I got was that you you want your dad to like it started out with your dad had said something like the only people who could possibly have voted for Trump were Fox News watchers or something
Mhm.
like that,
Something like
and
that.
your reaction was some variation. I'm going to oversimplify, but it was some variation of no, it's unacceptable for you to view things that way. I need to change your view of
Right. Yeah,
how
yeah.
Trump supporters work. Um, so, and then you proceeded to try to do so for a while, and this had some interesting consequences. Um, so, where my attention
Right.
goes,
And mostly it's just gotten us kind of I want to just say what the consequences are. In part because they're not that interesting. Um, and but like basically like we've gotten into this thing where my dad is sending me things where he's concerned about what's happening with the administration and I'm like this is all very partisan and it's not that I even think it's wrong. I I but then I end up polarized into these sort of opposing partisan view even though I'm trying to maintain more of a centrist or independent thing and then like and meanwhile we've sort of lost sight of the original theoretical intent of the conversation, which was to be about partisanship and like trying to have a good media diet rather than sort of
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So the places that whatever this magic process is that I'm going through, my attention immediately zooms into.
The word trying.
Kind of, but it's actually predominantly to why do you need his view to change? Like you implicitly have some sense of your experience of the world that includes like you have a problem.
Hmm.
I don't know what the problem is, such that it goes through needing your dad's view of Trump supporters to change. Like, this is one piece of many, but that's one piece that I immediately zoom in on.
Right. So I could, so, when you say that, I get various like answers kind of booting up to what's going on there. Shall I share those?
Sure.
Um, so one is something like the fact that many people are perceiving, are sort of have this flattened caricature of Trump supporters, which is not to say that there aren't also people who match his description, but this sort of idea that they're all like that feels to me representative of the the nature of the polarization that's happening, and um is a confusion that if the left didn't have it, which is a giant counterfactual for which I have not gotten a license, but a confusion that if the left didn't have it, they probably wouldn't have lost the last election, because they would have been able to actually appeal to actual swing voters which actually exist and were sitting there sincerely considering both options.
Hmm. Yeah. So I'm pausing because
It's a lot
yeah,
to compute.
it is a lot to compute, and I'll try to be a
Can
little
I share what
tricky.
I'm noticing so far? Does that make sense? Yeah,
Uh,
given that we've sort of walked through some of this already.
yeah, go for it.
Because I might have shorter compute loops because I haven't
Yeah.
drunk the full recursive potion yet, um, or something. So uh, so there were two pieces. Oh man, I'm having trouble even just remembering all the things. So
Huh.
it's like there's some sense of me being like upset about people having this confused view, and so in a way my dad is kind of a stand-in for a large class of people who I view as being confused in this way, and that's somehow that confusion which is showing up in a message from my dad is feels to me emblematic of the country's polarization, or not even the country. My dad is in Canada, but like the the
The
world's
world's
polarized. Right,
polarization.
right. The and in particular the current flavor of polarization in, let's say, the Western speaking world or the Anglosphere or whatever, like those kind.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So there's some. So it's like, but then there was something else I noticed, but it's slipping me a little bit here. So
Yeah. Yeah. Um, some of my experience, which I had a little time just now because I wanted to describe it, I have a little more space for, is um, uh, sometimes. So I noticed how that might be too hard to say. Uh, let me try. Um, there's a place where this whole how this whole process unfolds for me. I'm still quite confused about a particular aspect of it, which is something like when I am sharing information. Uh, by default, it that's going to be too messy. It's going to take too long.
you're trying to sort out your theory of change in relation to me right now. Yeah, right. I feel like for the purposes at least of the video that we're recording, that's worth just naming. Like that's transparent to me because I've watched you, you know, like go through all of all this
Yeah,
stuff often enough.
yeah,
And so it's like, so yeah, so you're trying to sort out, okay, so Malcolm, like my parents with the Tai Chi thing, Malcolm has, or Qigong thing, Malcolm has sort of enlisted my help in some sort of change. And yet,
right. Yeah, the whole business of like, I mean, for you in particular, it's easy for me, but like in general, this business
Hmm.
of whatever you are doing is the best thing that that life there can do and that intelligence over there can do for all of this.
Given what it knows and
And
is
so,
aware of and has learned and everything.
right. I mean, so like one piece of this, like in part, what I'm talking about is a correction to a tendency to to try to pressure change on a on a source of life when you have not fully seen what the problem set is that you are applying pressure to.
Right, right. And this is sort of the thing that I said links really strongly um with the perceptual control theory stuff where they talk about, I don't remember if they use the word coercion, but they talk about the challenge that shows up when you try to directly control anybody's behavior, including your own, where they, in their view, all behavior is just is sort of not a side effect exactly, but an emergent effect of systems that are seeking to control perception. And so,
Right,
and one other way to say control perception is to say solve problems. You have a bunch of hierarchically networked, complex problem solving systems that are doing what they're doing. And, you try to take your cigarette addiction away. And if it turns out you were using that to cope with the stress of this other thing, well, now either you need to find a porn addiction or some other cope, or you need to deal with the actual underlying source of stress or something, but you can't sort of simply make this free move.
right,
And this applies on all fractal scales, including, as you're noting, the intent to apply it.
exactly.
Yeah.
When I said that my theory of change changed, part of what happened was my relationship to the intent to apply it changed. So
Mm.
that it became
Oh,
self-consistent and aligned with
right.
science.
Sorry, say again?
So that it became self-consistent and aligned with science
Mm-hmm.
or good epistemology
Yeah.
or whatever.
Something I want to note here that I think is really interesting is that, when my dad and I first had this conversation where he said this thing about Fox News or whatever, and I, kind of got arguing in response. There's something really ironic about the whole thing where on multiple levels of abstraction, there was a kind of hypocrisy in my response. And I say that without shame, but it's just,
And and it you knew it and it didn't stop you.
yeah.
Like, and I think yes, yes, this.
Yeah. It's like, I was like, I was attempting to sort of force some sort of change in his view. And part of the thing I was attempting to force him to stop doing was trying to force these hypothetical Fox News viewers who he isn't doesn't even know and isn't even in touch with, but that's
Right, right.
another whole issue. But
So
there,
by my read, what you are describing right now, I would want to call something like calling your view of the theory names, your conscious view of the theory names.
okay.
Um, and so this is an equivalent to when the math teacher says, "Oh, the student got the problem wrong because they didn't think it through." It's the same move, but it's
Mm.
internal.
Both what I was doing in relation to my dad and what I was doing in relation to what I was doing with my dad.
Yeah, yeah. I
Like,
was highlighting that second one
yeah.
predominantly, but yeah, this element of, oh, I'm trying to do this thing where I'm trying to affect like the view that these amorphous people have of Trump supporters and Fox News people,
Mhm.
etc. Uh, and it
And
doesn't
that
make
doesn't make
sense
any
for me to do it
sense.
through my dad, but noticing that it doesn't make sense doesn't seem to be affecting me very much, and this is myrrh. So that myrrh is pressure on your own solution space.
Mm. It's like I'm doing that and I shouldn't be doing that. No.
No, I've just described a hypothesis. So if you have the attitude of, oh, I shouldn't be doing that, you're making the same mistake
No,
at
no,
the
no. I was
next
attempting
level.
to describe the mistake, not to say I
Ah,
shouldn't
ah,
be
ah,
doing this.
ah. Right. Yes, yeah.
Like I was just paraphrasing what you were saying. But
Yeah, yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah.
I
Okay.
would be. If I were doing that, that would be wrong and I should stop. Wait.
Yeah. Yeah. So that implies that there is you have a hypothesis, you have a theory of change, that you like the conscious version of it that you have here implies some stuff about like, oh, it doesn't make sense. Like the so there's two. I realize I'm using this term in two different ways. I didn't notice until this moment.
Oh.
Uh, Let me see if I can separate them properly. There's an implicit theory you are demonstrably operating under. You can tell you're operating under it because these are the actions you're doing. You don't necessarily get to know what that theory is, but it's there. It's the one that
Hmm.
has you wanting to argue with your dad.
Right. Right. That's not a random behavior. It is generated from some strategy.
Right. Then you have a conscious critique of what you consciously think that theory of change is when you reflect on it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Right. So when you say calling names, I want to translate that into imputing nonsensical motivations into it,
Yes.
like describing its motivations in a way that are nonsensical.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. Which I was attempting to highlight was the error that I was trying to point out in my dad,
Right. And
but badly, but sensibly.
right. So what all of that highlights is that the conscious understanding you have of your of the cause of your behavior
Hmm.
is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You actually have the data you need to determine that it's incorrect.
Right. So I should update. I'm trolling you a bit.
I know you're trolling me. um, so yeah, so then that this is part of where the recursion happens.
Yeah.
There's
So
like,
it's like, okay,
oh, yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So it's like I have the data that my conscious model of what this part of me is doing is wrong. And the also this conscious part of me, I'm starting to question that on some level, but this part of me that talks a bunch, um, is sort of nonetheless still inclined to call this other thing names, which is to say impute nonsensible motivations to it. Um, so why does that make sense? Like, why is it doing that?
Hmm.
Then
Yeah.
becomes a question that I could maybe get curious about. Or I might discover that it's in fact very important for me to not get curious about it, in which case I recurse and find out why it's it seems so important for me to not get curious about.
Uh, you don't have to find out. Um,
Hmm.
you can end up with an infinitely recursive. You can end up with an arms race that goes up the recursion stack if you insist on finding out on some meta level.
Oh, right. This is related to your hostile telepath thing.
Yeah, yeah. Um, the thing is that you can, in principle, know from this. I want to call it something like the law of intelligence or the law of life or something like that.
Yeah.
All
Nice.
life is knowledge of how to avoid death.
Yeah.
All life is an instantiation of solving problems.
Hmm.
Um, so, uh, and it does so with. I mean, anyway, that second part's unnecessary. It's more like a
An instantiation of a know-how of solving problems.
yeah,
Yeah, not just the solving of them, but the
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So I now I don't have to make myself believe that. That's part of the meta theory of change that shifted for me. Is that clicked and I went, oh, and then I'm watching that echo through my entire being. But the way that it shifted was through empiricism. It was through a recognition that, and a recognition that this empirical method, a proper subjective science, is in fact a method that, to the best of my ability to tell, cannot be beaten. And if it can be beaten, it will be um, uh, it will yield.
Right. Yeah.
So, um,
Right. Which is all very Popperian flavored, which makes sense given your
right.
like coming at this from David Deutsch and Popper and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So, um, so because of that, I can notice that I don't know. Like if I were in your shoes, I might
Mm,
orient to it and go, I don't know why this makes sense.
right, right. And focus on
But I
allowing the
do
not
know that it does
yeah, by
to
the
the
law
extent that
of
I do.
life or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's it seems like there's also a trust building process in that law of life or law of intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that, yeah, hearing you say that, I wonder whether a trust building process and doing science are basically synonymous. They're like just coming at the same thing from different angles.
Hmm.
Um,
That seems basically right to me. Yeah.
um, yeah. So, yeah. So this is not this is what I think is the point of tracing proofs. It's not that you're trying to pound a fact into your mind. It's that you can examine, following a path of reasoning, how it applies in a given situation and observe, does that actually make sense here? Not just
Hmm.
in abstract, but does it make sense here? You trace the reasoning and you discover, oh, it does, or oh, now I have to make this tweak to see how it applies here
Right.
and
I was making
understand the
some sort of
theorem better.
assumption that it turns out doesn't hold, and
Right. So when I look at that, and I imagine I'm conscious of the fact that we only
we
have
have
like
about 10 minutes. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so the thing is that you're experiencing a conscious problem with respect to this thing, which is that
Hmm.
you're having like by my read, you have a kind of like muddled relationship to the way that this ongoing discussion is going, and you're not even quite sure what boundaries to draw. Um, that I mean, I feel like I'm like there's a very specific intervention I keep wanting to make there. Muddle in that particular way is usually, in my experience, the sign of an anti-meme.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, and there's I think there are some very specific processes that are approximately necessary for orienting to anti-memes if we want to actually arrange them differently. But they
I
amount
would
to
love to do
solving.
that. Maybe we don't have time on this particular call. Call.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I
it
mean,
is
I
a
can.
call.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can very quickly outline it. But like we talked about it on some of our walks as well. But it's the gist of it is that every anti-meme is the reason we care about the anti-meme is because it's producing problems that are in fact part of a solution method to a problem that you can't know.
Right. Yeah.
So you have to, in order to get rid of the problems that are part of the anti-meme, you have to solve the underlying problem differently.
Hmm.
As and then there's a bunch of stuff that gets derived from there, such as if like what we were talking about on that walk was how whether the conscious mind is involved as part of the anti-meme. If it's not, then you can consciously align with the anti-meme without knowing what it is,
Hmm.
in part by noticing when it is trying to make you look away and you choose to look away rather than getting muddled. So in this case,
Mm-hmm.
it might look something like I don't know the details, but like just to come up with some fake examples. Um, Noticing where there is this tension of, this feels so messy with my dad, but I keep wanting to get into it with him, and I'm going to do it for a while. Oh man, I just wasted a bunch of time. And like noticing that that has some kind of muddle quality to it, and for whatever reason, your current strategy has you needing to engage with your dad.
And all sorts of other political things too. I mean, it's not just about him, but yes.
Right. So a move that, and I want to dig into some details and sort out
Yeah.
whether this is the correct move, but an example possible move that might be the right one here is something like noting, oh, the anti-meme needs me to plug into the political stuff here for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to plug in, maybe in these particular ways, but like there's some
Yeah.
details about how that works. But when I'm plugging in, I'm consciously doing it with, okay, I feel this tug and I'm now going to align.
Rather than sort of being in resistance, but it's winning. Like
Right.
there's this kind of yeah.
Right. Because what you're trying to do internally is a move that is something like the goal in this method is that you're trying to reduce pressure on the anti-meme so that its solution space is wider.
Right. And so that um it can see where there might be opportunities to collaborate with the more conscious structures.
Yeah, or it might be more appropriate to say that it doesn't have to silo the conscious mind as much.
Right, in order to get to keep doing what it needs to do according to it, and it has the power to, yeah,
Right, right.
yeah.
Um, yeah. So, given all of that, the way that this theory of change stuff recurses is like if you find from me describing this that you change your relationship to the arguments with your dad, great. If
Hmm.
you don't, then the question becomes, why does it make sense for you not to, even given this frame?
Hmm.
Right? And you don't have to figure it out. All you have to do is have guesses that seem reasonable and apply crucial tests.
Hmm.
If you get the crucial tests right, you will find your behavior changing. You never have to make your behavior change.
Mm-hmm.
But that idea is not one you need to make yourself do.
That's also a thing that you can test and
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
just very rapidly going through like three layers of recursion.
totally, totally. One of the things that I'm most curious about here is something like on some level I got all of this back in 2020 with my NNTD insight. And yet here I am. So there's some sort of cascade that didn't happen from that directly. Um,
I currently don't have a model of what the difference is. It is also possible that there isn't one and that this is just a burst of grace. And you got an earlier burst of this same grace, and we'll find it evaporating over time. I don't know.
mm,
Um, but yeah, I don't. Currently, the way that it feels, um, like I feel like I understand much more deeply a bunch of the things that you've been talking about. I
mhm.
also feel like I suddenly understand way better why the Popperians keep talking about, or the critical rationalists, I should say, keep talking about um, coercion being bad, and why preservation of knowledge and the development of knowledge and creativity are also critical. Why they're so key.
Mhm, mhm.
These all feel immediately downstream of all of this.
Yeah,
Um, uh, but anyway, I ramble a little bit. I don't know whether there is a difference, and if so, what it is yet.
yeah. I sense there is one. Um, and let me just take a moment and kind of feel into. I mean, it feels related to the thing about coalitions that I brought up the other night, where I got in principle that I, wow, this is interesting. This is very interesting. I was about to say that I got in principle that I was supposed to blah 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 this recursive non-coercive structure. But what the fuck was this supposed to doing there? And so I think there's a level on which I saw the structure and it propagated through certain paths. But then
Yeah,
on some other level, I've I've still been subject to my old theory of change
yeah.
or something.
There's a piece of subjective science that I think may be really relevant here. Um, like why it is that subjective science hasn't been developed before,
Hmm.
or if it has, it's been fragmentary or whatever. Like why it is so diminished compared to objective science.
Yeah.
Um, whenever like all of the interesting cases of subjective science are interesting because the act of forming the hypothesis interacts with the space that you're forming hypotheses about.
Hmm.
And this also affects the structure of the crucial tests. Um, NNTD, as you have expressed it, has always occurred to me as recursive but not self-referential.
Hmm, interesting. It definitely has some view of itself as being self-referential.
I don't mean it self-referential. I mean, that is what I said, but I apologize. I'm using some bad words. What I mean is the act of using it uh, can nudge towards recursion, but the way that I hear you using it is usually like you're going one or two steps. It doesn't seem to naturally, I mean, maybe it logically demands this, but I haven't observed you doing it.
Well,
Maybe I just
right. I
haven't
mean,
seen
it's
it,
possible
which
that
is that your recursion stops.
yeah, I mean that might be I have often thought of myself as having a fair bit of working memory, but and maybe I do, but nonetheless, I think there this might be one of those things where it's like a limitation of attentional bandwidth on my part, where some part of the way through the recursion, I hit something that like is emotionally salient for me or is just strikes me as a good idea, and then I just try it, and I haven't had a kind of dedication to seeing the recursion through till it sort of converges or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that may be a big part of the difference, which is interesting too, though, because that's a difference in like that's describing a difference in character between you and me, and therefore doesn't describe how, to some extent, when you started grokking NNTD over the last few years, you didn't immediately start doing this. Like instead, there was this whole arc with Popper and the other stuff.
Yeah. I do feel like somehow that stuff was key for
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
It was really key. Um,
Right. Whereas mine came, this is maybe relevant actually. Mine came more through coherence therapy, which also takes this view that like everything you do makes sense to some part of you, and you just got to figure out what that part is. And then NNTD was sort of like a generalization of the notion of coherence therapy, A, out of just the context of therapy, and B, into a sort of fractal structure where it's like, okay, well, and if part of you doesn't trust the process by which you're going around like sorting out these trust issues, then that thing, I think I'm seeing things, and maybe I guess we'll just wrap here for time. But one interesting thing that I'm taking away from this is coming back to the thing I was saying the other night about coalitions. Um, I think I think that I was relying on in my approach to the recursion. I was relying on a certain experience of encountering the resistance as being the sign that I needed to do more recursion, and was underappreciating the extent to which the resistance could be temporarily overpowered that would sort of allow one to ignore it, even, and so it's like in situations where I couldn't ignore the resistance, I
hmm.
would have this process that would run and would generate
Oh,
a different
oh,
response.
oh, hypothesis.
Yeah.
Distrust is a description of resistance. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that NNTD actually pivots in practice. It pivots predominantly on tracking distrust.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the the equivalent place in what I'm doing is actually tracking whether there's a problem, but they are not the same structure. Like distrust and problemness are not the same. This is
They're
quite important.
related, but yeah.
Yeah. In fact, you can have distrust and have no problem.
I gotta go. On the next episode of two guys having a conversation via screens, even though they are 50 feet apart. Um, Learn more about how you can have distrust without having a problem. Whatever. Anyway, maybe we'll do some sort of sequel to this. Maybe we won't. If we do, I will link it below when or in some lovely doodly do here when I make it. And yeah, but for now, I think this has been not as fruitful as I was hoping, but I think nonetheless worth posting. And definitely let us know below if you have questions, if you have insights, whatever. Those we can fold into stuff.
Yeah.
All right, take care.